On my 51st birthday, I was sitting in a restaurant I'd chosen, wearing a dress I'd bought with money I'd earned, surrounded by people I thought loved me. The lighting was soft, those warm amber bulbs they install in upscale places in Portland, Oregon to make everyone look like they're in a commercial. My husband Michael stood up from our table at exactly 7:47 in the evening. I remember the time because I glanced at my phone to see a text from my sister congratulating me, and that's when he began to speak. He didn't tap his glass first. He didn't ask the waiter for permission. He just stood, and the restaurant seemed to understand that something important was happening because conversations around us faded like someone had hit a mute button. Michael cleared his throat, that particular way he did when he was nervous, the same way he'd done it when he proposed to me 26 years earlier in a completely different restaurant, in a completely different life. He announced that he was leaving me for a woman named Brittany, who was 29 years old and worked at his law firm as a paralegal. He said he needed to find himself. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said he deserved to be happy. And then he looked directly at our son, Marcus, who was sitting across from me at that table, and something passed between them. A look that said this wasn't news to Marcus, that they'd discussed this, that Marcus had been expecting it. Marcus smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a shocked smile. A knowing smile. And then he clapped. Slowly. Like he was congratulating his father for making the winning touchdown in a game I didn't even know we were playing. That's when I stood up. That's when I said 4 words that would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, about family, about who was actually in control. I said, "She already signed it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was crowded with confusion and fear, and the sudden understanding that they had made a terrible miscalculation. I sat back down, picked up my wine glass, and drank it completely empty while watching their faces transform. My other son, David, looked confused. My husband's face went the color of flour. Brittany, who'd been waiting in a back booth for her victory, texted Michael 3 times in rapid succession. I could see his phone vibrating in his jacket pocket. He didn't answer it. Let me rewind and tell you who I actually was before that moment, because this story isn't really about betrayal. It's about the things we control that other people never notice until it's too late. My name is Rachel Sheffield, and I spent 26 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside. I was the kind of wife who made breakfasts on Sunday mornings, who remembered everyone's birthday without a calendar reminder, who kept a color-coded spreadsheet of our entire financial life. Most people saw the house. They saw the vacations. They saw Michael's 3 successful business ventures and thought he was some kind of genius entrepreneur. What they didn't see was me, at 11 o'clock every night, reviewing contracts and insurance policies and restructuring trusts while Michael watched television downstairs. I paid for his first business to recover from bankruptcy. My inheritance funded that. I managed the refinancing on our home when interest rates dropped, saving us $340,000 over the life of the loan. I set up the college funds for our boys, maxing out 529 plans, managing their growth, adjusting allocations as they aged. I kept a legal pad where I wrote down every major financial decision, every password, every account number, every investment vehicle. I did this not because I was controlling. I did this because Michael didn't want to do it. He said it bored him. He said he trusted me. Those weren't red flags back then. They were just the natural rhythm of a partnership where one person was built for details and the other person was built for charm. Michael was charming. That was his gift. He could walk into a room and make anyone feel like the most important person he'd met all day. Clients loved him. Judges respected him. Strangers wanted to buy him drinks. I loved that about him, honestly. I wasn't jealous of his charisma. I was proud of it. What I didn't know was that somewhere around year 23 of our marriage, his charm had calcified into something else, something that looked like confidence but was actually entitlement. He started making jokes about my age. Nothing cruel, just observations. He'd say things like, "You'd be so beautiful if you just used that new serum from that clinic in Seattle," or, "Have you thought about Botox? All the wives at the firm are doing it now." These weren't compliments dressed up as suggestions. They were auditions. He was auditioning for his own new life, and he was testing whether I'd rewrite myself to keep him. I didn't. And that's when he stopped trying to recruit me for that new version and started looking for someone who was already built for it. Brittany was the kind of woman who understood the assignment immediately. She was young enough that her face hadn't thought about falling yet. She wore clothes that looked like she'd walked directly out of an Instagram advertisement. She laughed at Michael's jokes in that particular way that made it sound like she'd never heard anything so clever in her entire existence. She made him feel young by proximity. That's all infidelity ever really is. A person trying to feel something about themselves by being reflected in someone else's eyes. My sons noticed the change in Michael before I did, but they didn't tell me. They watched it happen and, gradually, they began to mirror it. Marcus was the first. He was 23, in his first year of law school, following directly in his father's footsteps. One Tuesday evening, he came home and made a comment about how his girlfriend Sarah was getting kind of boring and how he was thinking about dating someone with more ambition and fire. That should have been my wake-up call. Instead, I made his favorite dinner and tried to talk to him about commitment and character and all the things I believed in. He listened politely and changed the subject. David, my younger son, was 21 and still in college at University of Washington in Seattle, studying business. He was the one who actually said the words that cut the deepest. He called me one Sunday afternoon in early spring and I asked how school was going and he said, "Mom, you ever notice how Dad gets excited about life, but you just sort of exist?" The casual cruelty of that observation, the fact that my own son had internalized this narrative that I was somehow the problem, that my devotion was actually exhaustion, that my reliability was actually lack of ambition, that hurt worse than anything Michael ever said to me. But I didn't argue with him. I just listened and I absorbed it and I started to wonder if they were right. Maybe I had become boring. Maybe all those nights reading contracts while Michael slept peacefully were nights I should have been at wine bars, being interesting and mysterious. Maybe I'd made myself too available. Maybe I'd been too willing to be the background character in everyone else's story. These thoughts festered all through the spring. I started going to the gym more obsessively. I got my hair done in a way that felt less mom and more woman who reads, which isn't actually a thing but was what I was trying to accomplish. I bought new clothes. I unfollowed people on Instagram who seemed too domestic and started following lifestyle accounts that made me feel inadequate in new and creative ways. And while I was doing all of this internal work to become more interesting, more desirable, more whatever they wanted me to be, Michael was planning his exit strategy. The email came on a Tuesday. I didn't notice it at first because it landed in my spam folder, hidden between a notification from some luxury hotel I didn't subscribe to and an ad for a cryptocurrency that would never exist. The email was from a lawyer, a very expensive lawyer based in Seattle, asking me to confirm receipt of a legally binding document. My hands went cold. I pulled the PDF and started reading, and with every sentence, I felt the ground I'd been standing on my entire marriage begin to shift in ways that were actually invisible. The document was a prenuptial agreement. Michael had signed it, but so had I. Except I had no memory of ever signing anything like this. The date on the signature line was from 4 years earlier. The month Michael started talking about Brittany. I called our family attorney, Patricia Chun, who I'd hired 15 years earlier for our estate planning. Patricia answered on the first ring because we had that kind of relationship where my number got priority status. I said, "Patricia, did I sign a prenup 4 years ago?" There was a very long silence. Then she said, "Rachel, I need you to come to my office in Portland tomorrow morning. Don't bring Michael. Don't tell him we're meeting." When I arrived at Patricia's office in downtown Portland, with its views of the Willamette River and its oak furniture that smelled like old money and competence, Patricia told me that she had never filed anything on my behalf. She'd never been contacted about any new prenuptial agreement. Someone else had prepared that document. Someone Michael had hired. And while the document bore my signature, Patricia said very carefully that she couldn't guarantee its authenticity without a forensic review. What she could tell me was this: the prenup I'd signed when we actually got married had several clauses that Michael clearly didn't know about because I'd updated it. 15 years ago, right after David was born, I'd been paranoid and controlling about financial security, Or maybe I was just realistic about divorce statistics, so I'd added language about business valuations, about asset splits, about trust distributions. I'd funded those trusts with money from my inheritance and from money I'd earned working as a business consultant before I'd stepped back to raise the boys and manage the family finances. Michael had signed it all without reading it carefully. He'd trusted me. These clauses were going to be very, very valuable to me in ways that he clearly had not anticipated. I didn't tell Michael I knew about the forged prenup. I didn't call Patricia back immediately. Instead, I went home, sat at my desk, and pulled up every financial document I'd ever created. I opened my spreadsheets. I reviewed my notes. I looked at the trusts. I traced the money paths. And I realized something extraordinary. I'd structured our financial life in such a way that while it looked like Michael had been building wealth, while it looked like his business ventures had made us rich, the actual foundation of our money existed in places he didn't have access to. The house was held in a trust one controlled. The business had been restructured 3 years earlier in a way that limited his ownership stake. The children's education funds were in their names now, not his. The retirement accounts had beneficiary designations he couldn't change. I'd built all of this not because I was plotting some grand revenge. I'd built it because I was anxious and thorough and wanted to protect my children. I'd built it because, on some subconscious level, I never completely trusted that Michael's loyalty was permanent. I'd been right. The 4 words I said at my 51st birthday dinner were the moment when Michael and Marcus and David understood that they'd been operating with incomplete information about who actually held the power in our family. It wasn't delivered with anger. It wasn't delivered with tears. It was delivered with absolute certainty, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly what documents say and exactly what authority you actually possess. The word "she" meant I was speaking about the prenup, but they initially thought I meant Brittany. They thought I was making an accusation. Then Michael's face shifted as he understood. Brittany hadn't signed anything. But the prenup, his new prenup, the one he'd forged my signature on or had someone else forge, had someone's signature on it. And that someone was a witness, a lawyer, someone official who could verify that this entire document was meaningless and fraudulent. I'd had Patricia verify it all that morning, and I'd kept copies. Multiple copies. Digital and physical. I'd done what I always did. I'd documented everything. The dinner ended without dessert. Michael excused himself to take a phone call from Brittany that I could see was increasingly panicked through his body language. Marcus looked at his father and then back at me, and I watched the moment when his adolescent certainty about the world, that money and youth and charm were the only currencies that mattered, began to crack. David called me from Seattle that night and asked, very carefully, if Mom was going to be okay financially. The question itself was an apology. It was his way of saying that he'd been naive, that he'd been manipulated by his father's narrative, that he was beginning to understand that his mother was not a boring background character, but actually the person who'd been managing the entire game while everyone else thought they were playing. What happened next was not a moment of triumph. Triumph is what you feel when you defeat an enemy. What I felt was sadness, which is what you feel when you realize that the people closest to you are never actually thinking about you at all. The legal process took 4 months. Michael's lawyer tried to argue that the prenup was invalid because of the forged signature, which is true, but the argument also created a different problem for him. Proving that the document was forged meant proving that he'd commissioned the forgery, which meant proving premeditation, which meant proving that he'd been planning to leave me and restructure assets in a deceptive way. His lawyer advised him to accept a standard marital asset split based on the original prenup we'd signed. He accepted it. Brittany left when the money stopped appearing in the forms she expected. She moved to Los Angeles and started dating a venture capitalist. I saw this on Instagram, which is where I learned about most of the aftermath because I didn't actually speak to Michael or Marcus for almost 6 months. During those 6 months, I renovated my kitchen. I took a pottery class. I started volunteering at the community center in Portland, teaching financial literacy to people who'd made the same mistake I had, investing their entire lives in people who'd never once thought to invest in them. David, my younger son, did something brave. He left law school and started his own business. Not to impress his father, but because he wanted to build something that was actually his. He still calls me every Sunday. He asks for advice about contracts and financial planning, and I give it to him freely because he's asking, and that's the difference between love and manipulation. Marcus took longer. He stayed in law school. He got a job at a firm in San Francisco. He didn't call for 14 months, and then one Tuesday evening in September, exactly 6 months before what would have been our 27th anniversary, he texted me. The message was short. It said, "Mom, I'm sorry. You were right about everything, and I was an asshole. I told Dad that, by the way." He didn't like hearing it. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with that message for 3 days. I thought about what I wanted to say back. I thought about whether forgiveness was something I owed him or something he needed to earn, and I realized that the answer was yes to both, that forgiveness isn't a debt we pay, and it's also not a gift we give. It's actually just the choice to keep living without carrying something that was never ours to carry in the first place. I called him. We talked for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Most of it was quiet. Some of it was him explaining how he'd gradually understood that the version of success he'd been chasing, the one that looked like his father, the one that felt like winning at the expense of other people, wasn't actually successful at all. It was just lonely in a very particular way that took him a year to articulate. Michael called me 2 months later. It was a Tuesday, which seems to be the day that important things happen in my life. He said, "Rachel, I think I made a mistake." I said, "I know." He asked if we could talk about what comes next, and I told him that what comes next is the rest of his life, and that I couldn't actually be a part of that anymore, that I'd already lived one life with him, and that one had been enough. He asked me if I was angry, and I told him the truth. I wasn't angry. I was just finished. Anger is for people who are still fighting. I'd stopped fighting the moment I said those 4 words at my birthday dinner. I was just living now, which was something entirely different. The thing that nobody tells you about revenge is that it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like relief. It feels like putting down something heavy that you've been carrying so long that you forgot it was weight. The house is still mine. The trusts are still intact. The boys are finding their way to adulthood through their own choices instead of through reaction to my or their father's narratives. I'm dating someone I met at pottery class, which sounds like the opening line of a joke. But it's actually just my life now, a life where I make choices because they feel good, not because they make someone else feel better about themselves. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. The aftermath of that dinner continued to ripple through my family in ways that I didn't anticipate. Michael, after I refused to take his calls, tried a different approach. He sent me emails. Long, detailed emails where he explained his version of events, where he tried to reframe the narrative so that he wasn't the villain. He was just a man who'd made a bad choice in a moment of temporary insanity. He said that Brittany had seduced him. He said that the stress of his law practice had made him irrational. He said that he'd been having a midlife crisis, and that midlife crises were a medical condition, something that happened to people, not something they did to people. None of these emails mentioned that he'd attempted to defraud me with a forged prenup. None of them acknowledged that his sons had known about his betrayal and had chosen his side. He wrote about what a good father he'd been, about all the things he'd provided, about the investments he'd made in their education and their futures. What he didn't write about was the fact that I had paid for most of those things. I had funded those college accounts. I had negotiated the tuition. I had organized the scholarships. But those emails, they hurt in a different way than the actual betrayal had hurt. They hurt because they confirmed something I'd begun to suspect during those long nights when I was reviewing financial documents while everyone else slept. Michael had not just cheated on me, he had no actual understanding of how much I had sacrificed to build the life he'd taken for granted. He didn't see me, not as a partner, not as an equal. I was a function, something that happened like a service provided by the bank or the utility company. In October, Michael filed his response to my divorce petition. His lawyer argued that he should receive more spousal support because, although the original prenup limited his claims, his contributions to the family had been significant, and my decision to stay out of the workforce had limited his earning potential. The argument was both technically true and morally obscene. Yes, I had stepped back from my consulting career. No, it had not limited his earning potential. It had freed him from the responsibilities of childcare and household management so that he could devote his entire intellectual energy to becoming a lawyer and building his businesses. My sacrifice had enabled his success. His argument tried to reframe my sacrifice as something he'd done for me, as though staying home with our children had been his gift to me rather than a choice we'd made together about how to structure our family's time and labor. Patricia, my attorney, my ally, my voice for the 18 hours a day when I wasn't sure I had won, sat across from me in her office and said the words that changed everything a second time. She said, "Rachel, you're going to get everything, but you're going to hate having it." What Patricia meant was that I could win every legal battle and still lose something essential. I could keep the house, but it would always have the memory of Michael announcing his affair in it. I could keep the trusts, but they would always represent the life I'd built while someone else lived it. I could keep my independence and my financial security, but independence and financial security without love, without the particular kind of love that comes from being truly known and truly chosen, these are hollow victories. They're the kind of win that makes you wonder if you were fighting for the right thing. She suggested, very carefully, that I might want to consider a settlement. Not because Michael deserved one. Not because he'd been wronged in any way. But because the alternative, the legal path that led directly to absolute victory, was going to require me to spend the next year of my life reliving the details of his betrayal, contesting his arguments, proving that his narrative was false. It was going to cost me emotionally, even though it wouldn't cost me financially. I told Patricia that I would think about it. I went home and sat in my kitchen, the one I'd renovated, the one that now looked exactly how I'd always wanted it to look, and I realized that I'd made a fundamental error in my approach to this entire situation. I'd thought of the victory as the moment when I said those 4 words at my birthday dinner. I'd imagined that the satisfaction would come from watching the understanding wash over their faces as they realized they'd miscalculated. But the actual satisfaction, the real, deep-in-your-bones satisfaction, wasn't happening at all. It wasn't happening because I was too busy trying to win to actually notice that I'd already lost something I cared about far more than money or victory or the ability to say, "I told you so," at the Thanksgiving table. What I'd lost was the belief that the world operated according to the principles I'd been taught to believe in, that honesty would be rewarded, that hard work would be valued, that if you sacrificed for people they would remember it and honor it and never take it for granted. I'd lost the belief that love was supposed to work the way it did in movies and in the stories my mother had told me when I was young, where the woman stood by her man, and eventually the man understood her value, and they ended up together in some kind of sunset scene of mutual recognition. I didn't actually care about the money. I cared about the fact that I'd organized my entire life around being useful, and Michael had taken that usefulness for granted so completely that he'd tried to leave without even acknowledging what I'd given him. That realization, that the real crime wasn't the affair or the betrayal, but the absolute absence of gratitude or recognition, that was harder to process than the legal documents or the prenup forgery or any of the financial calculations. So I called Patricia back and I said, offer him a settlement. Something fair. Something that lets him maintain his dignity and move on with his life. I don't want him to lose everything. I just want him to understand what he lost. Patricia said something that I've thought about every day since. Rachel, he may never understand that. And you may need to be okay with that. She was right. Michael accepted the settlement. It was generous. It was more generous than he deserved if we're being honest about what he deserved. He got to keep a significant portion of his business equity. He got spousal support for 5 years. He got to maintain a relationship with the boys, although that relationship had been fundamentally changed by his actions and by their participation in his betrayal. What he didn't get was the life he'd imagined. He didn't get to be young and free and unburdened. He got to be a 49-year-old man starting over, which is a hard thing to be, and which I wouldn't wish on anyone, but which is also the consequence of making choices that hurt people who had never done anything except love you and support you and organize their entire lives around supporting yours. A year after the settlement, Michael moved to Denver to start a new practice. Brittany was long gone. She'd moved on to a succession of men with increasingly better financial portfolios and increasingly worse marriages. Marcus finished law school and got a job at a firm in San Francisco. He made partner at 35, and when he called to tell me, he cried on the phone and said, "Mom, I did this without trying to prove anything to Dad. I just did it for myself, and it feels so much better." David's business succeeded in ways that surprised everyone. He hired 50 people. He started a scholarship fund named after me, which I didn't know about until I got the notification, and when I saw that my name was attached to an institution that was helping young people, people who didn't look like me, who came from backgrounds I didn't understand, who were trying to build lives, I understood something about legacy that I hadn't understood before. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind when you're done. It's about what you create while you're still here, and whether that creation is actually useful to someone other than yourself. The pottery class ended, and then the pottery class started again. I joined a new group. I made a teapot that didn't hold water. It was entirely non-functional, but it was beautiful, and the instructor displayed it in the studio anyway because she understood that sometimes the point of creation isn't functionality, it's just proof that you existed, that you tried, that your hands can make something that wasn't there before. The man I met in pottery class is named Robert. He's a retired architect who designed buildings in Portland and Seattle and Spokane. He has 3 adult children from his first marriage, and his first marriage ended not because of betrayal, but because they both just realized one day that they'd changed in incompatible directions. He's the kind of person who remembers things I say weeks later and brings them up in conversation. He asks me questions about myself and actually listens to the answers. He doesn't use me as a mirror to feel better about himself. He just likes me, and that simplicity is so shocking after 26 years of complexity that sometimes I have to remind myself that this is what it's supposed to feel like. When I told him the story about Michael and the birthday dinner and the 4 words, he didn't try to fix it or minimize it or turn it into a lesson about what I should have done differently. He just said, "That must have been really hard," and then he asked if I wanted to talk about it anymore or if I wanted to go to dinner instead. I chose dinner. And that choice, that small, simple choice to move forward instead of backward, turned out to be the most important choice of all. My mother was wrong about 1,000 subscribers. I have 17,000 now, and I'm going to have more because there are stories that need to be told, and there are people listening to this right now who are where I was, who are trying to figure out how to be strong without being cold, how to be strategic without being cruel, how to protect themselves while still staying open to love. The story isn't about revenge. Revenge is what you do when you're still caught in the past. The story is about understanding that you don't actually need anyone to recognize your value for your value to be real. The story is about financial independence, yes, but also about emotional independence, the understanding that your worth is not determined by how much someone else is willing to pay attention to you. If you're listening right now, you're not listening because you want to see someone destroyed. You're listening because you want to know that if you're betrayed, if you're taken for granted, if you build a life that goes unappreciated, there's a version of the story where you end up okay. More than okay. Actually happy. And I'm here to tell you that version is possible, but only if you're willing to do the boring work of reading contracts, of protecting yourself, of building trusts, of creating structures that will hold you up when everything else falls away. The work that makes you interesting isn't the dramatic moment when you say 4 words and watch someone's face change. The interesting work is the quiet work you do every single day to understand your own life well enough that you can make decisions from a place of knowledge instead of from a place of fear or anger or the desperate hope that someone will finally see you. Michael sent me a card for my 54th birthday. It arrived 3 weeks late, and I almost threw it away without opening it, but I read it instead. It said, "I'm sorry for everything. I wasn't the man you deserved." I don't know if he meant it. I don't know if he's actually sorry, or if he's just sorry that consequences exist, and that he has to live with them. But I do know that his apology doesn't actually matter to me anymore, and that's how I know I'm finally free. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Help me reach that 1,000 subscribers that my mother said was impossible. But more importantly, help yourself. Help the version of you that's still wondering if you're strong enough to walk away, if you're brave enough to be alone, if the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of staying. It's not. And you're stronger than you know.